May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Yesterday, I was riding back from my parents' house in the car with my spouse, and we decided to read today's gospel together and reflect on it in the car ride. As soon as she finished the last word, I blurted out with my hands gripping the steering wheel more tightly, "Where is the good news in that?" Where is the good news in today's gospel lesson? In this parable, we hear of a very wealthy landowner entrusting the people that he owns as slaves with money that still belongs to him and returns to him, the already wealthy landowner. And a biblical talent is not juggling nor singing, but rather a measure of money that's worth roughly 15 or 16 years' daily wages for a day laborer. We are talking about a massive sum of money. This is a very wealthy landowner. And he gives one slave 5 talents, another 2, another 1. And the first 2 slaves double their master's money and return to him this larger sum and are praised as being responsible. But the third, not very diplomatically, declares, "Master, I knew that you were a harsh man and that you were taking crops that you didn't plant, and that you were being greedy, and I was afraid. I was afraid of what might happen if I lost your money or if I spent it in a way that you didn't want me to spend it. I was afraid. So I dug a hole in the earth and I buried it. Here, you can have back what is yours." The third slave is a sympathetic character. I think it makes a lot of sense what he does, and yet even he is punished. He's cast out into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And my friends, whenever I read a gospel and it ends with the weeping and gnashing of teeth, I find myself asking, where is the good news? When I hear this familiar parable, I hear a tragic story of a rich slave master getting richer off the work of others, while the poor remain poor. For to all those who have, more will be given, but from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. I hear a harsh and powerful man punishing a fearful, disenfranchised man. In all honesty, this is one of my least favorite parables. Where can we find good news in the image of a harsh and greedy slave master? I don't think, nor will I try, I don't think I can redeem this master for us this morning. Frankly, I don't want to. His behavior leaves me asking not only where is the good news in this story, but where is God in his behavior? Parables, by their very nature, are challenging. As Father Ignacio so beautifully shared last Sunday, one of the purposes of parables is to pull us out of our certainty, out of our comfort zones, and to leave us full of questions rather than answers and certainty. When we resist the urge to oversimplify a parable message, then the parable can be far more disorienting and carry even deeper meaning and possibilities. And so a parable is not about the surface level imagery that we see on the page. It's much deeper, and it's about our practice of faith. Yet, of course, the images chosen do matter. And so when this morning's parable assumes the institution of slavery, some readers will balk, and indeed, perhaps all should. The question is, however, what do we do in response? What meaning can we make with this parable? Where can we find this good news? We are in the middle week of 3 weeks of very difficult parables at the end of Matthew's gospel. Jesus teaches these days before his trial and crucifixion. Last week, we heard the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. Today, we hear the parable of the talents. And spoilers, next week, we will hear the parable of the great judgment, or the sheep and goats. The three, however, are grouped together for good reason. As often is the case for Matthew, a set of parables carries strongly related themes. So, last week's parable can help to inform our understanding of today's, which in turn will help us to understand next week's. And a common thread throughout all three of these parables is readiness. Matthew's Jesus tells us that we must be ready. Now, as I said earlier, this parable is not my top choice of passages. However, the main reason for that is the way I have heard it interpreted throughout my life in the church. This passage is at high risk of conveying what I consider to be some very dangerous messages. I have heard sermons about this parable of the talents in which the preacher tells us a moral story that we are called to use our gifts and our talents for the glory of God and not to hide and bury them away. That is a fine sermon, but it is not what you will hear from me this morning. I've also heard interpretations in which this parable is used to promote stewardship campaigns and pledges by preaching that God is like the master and we are like the slaves, and we are meant to learn something about giving more to the church. That particular interpretation causes my heart to sink into my gut, because while I will not claim to understand every layer of this parable, there is one thing I feel very certain about. I am confident that the master is not God. And God is not like the master in this story. The master is described as a harsh man who exploits others for personal gain, and when even the third servant accuses him of being this way, the master does not deny it. This does not align with the big things we know to be true about God who forgives and loves freely. To reduce God to a flawed person characterized by his greed and harshness is to do what I consider to be very dangerous theology. So if God is not the master in this story, where is God present in this parable? Where is the good news? perhaps where I find God most clearly in this story is in the honesty with which this parable describes our profit and productivity-obsessed world. In the deep honesty of this parable, Jesus calls our attention to our very flawed human attempts to equate wealth and power and measures of success in our society as equal to salvation or measures of a successful faith life. But remember, it is the very same gospel narrative in which Matthew's Jesus instructs us to go sell all your possessions and give the money to the poor. Then you will find treasure in heaven. This is the very same gospel in which we are told to love others. And so I wonder if perhaps Jesus wants us to come away from this parable asking the question, where is God in this? Where is God in this description of greed, of pursuing wealth above all else? Where is God in that? Maybe Jesus wants us to be asking, where is God in the pursuits of money, power, productivity, and earthly success? I grew up in Northern Virginia, and I feel pretty confident that there's a special kind of stress in the air here. Stress and pressure to be exceptional, to succeed in a way that outdoes everyone around you, to be important. There's pressure to have not just enough, but to have an abundance of wealth. There's pressure to impress those around us. And I can't speak for you, but I know for myself, I struggle to find God in those pursuits. I struggle to find God's presence when I am running the race of Northern Virginia stressors. And so maybe through this parable, Jesus invites us to ask, indeed, where is God as we chase straight A's for our students, or job promotions, or money, or prestige, or productivity? Where is God in those things? It is not the wrath of a greedy master that will save or condemn us, because the master in this story is not God. It is not whether we can double the talents we've been given or whether we bury them in the ground. It is not an economic transaction that is required for salvation. The master in this story is not God. Through his parables, Jesus prepares the crowds and the temple leaders around him, and he invites them to be ready. And Jesus prepares us as well through this parable. Jesus prepares us with forgiveness instead of judgment, forgiveness instead of wrath. Jesus prepares us with the word of life rather than the word that casts out into outer darkness. Jesus prepares us with the waters of baptism that wash us clean of our greed and our desire for earthly power. Jesus prepares us with the bread and the wine of salvation, food that fills us like no amount of profit or prestige could ever fill us. As Jesus tells the parable of the talents today, we discover once again that this parable may not be about what it seems to be on the surface. And as much as we try to make faith and salvation fit our terms, as much as we try to make greed and productivity virtues, Jesus is pointing us back to God, God who comes without power, but with love. God who surrenders all earthly powers in favor of generosity and caring and love and compassion. Jesus is showing us in this parable, on the cross, here in the word and bread and wine, that God's salvation is freely given. God's love is not transactional. God's mercy is already for you. God gives freely to us and for us and for all. And that, my friends, is very, very good news. God gives you love, salvation, mercy, compassion, all of these things freely, without transaction, regardless of how much power, prestige, success, etc. you have or lack. And that is good news.